This is Research Like a Pro, episode 164, the Research Like a Pro with DNA eCourse, part 5. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, a Genealogist Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi, Nicole. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I've been wrestling with DNA GEDCOM and trying to get it to download matches so I can make a network graph. And every once in a while, things don't work the way I want them to. And so it's frustrating, but it eventually worked. And I created a network graph for somebody, and they had the most pedigree collapse I've ever seen for someone from the southern states. It was
Oh, no.
crazy. Her parents are related. And so all of the clusters are overlapping to each other. So
Oh, shoot.
she wants to work on her paternal side. So I tried to remove the clusters that were maternal, and that helped a little bit. But still, it's just so many connections between the clusters. In fact, when DNA GEDCOM downloads the matches, it creates an in common with spreadsheet for all of the shared matches of all the matches for the range you put in. And I put in 15 centimorgans and up. And usually that's fine. But this time, when I opened the spreadsheet, Excel said it couldn't load all of the spreadsheets. So I had to use like a spreadsheet splitter program, and it split it into 5 different files because Excel will not open anything past about 1,000,000 rows. And she had so many shared matches, so many connections between her matches that she had over 4 million rows that needed to be
What?
created. So I had to do 30 centimorgans and up, and that worked much better.
So before you were doing 20?
15.
Oh, 15. Okay.
Yeah. So the number of matches fit just fine. It was like 50,000 matches or something. But then the connections between the matches were so many
Right.
that it was too much for one spreadsheet.
Oh, my word. That is super interesting. What locality are these people
Kentucky.
in Kentucky?
Yeah.
We have had some client projects too with that pedigree collapse and running the network graphs and DNA tree. I've seen so much pedigree collapse and trying to figure out how to work with it. So, it's good to figure it out though.
Yeah, one of the strategies we're employing is using other people's DNA that are related to the research subject. So she has her aunt and a first cousin. So we're going to focus on their DNA results. They're also one generation closer. So it's,
Yeah.
if you can look at other people's, they might have less of that relatedness.
Yeah,
That's the
that's a
hope.
great tip.
Yeah. So what have you been doing?
Well, in the last week, I've given 4 presentations, 2 society Zoom calls, and then 2 webinars, one for the Southern California Genealogy Society, and then one on timelines and evidence analysis for Family Tree Magazine. So that's been fun. It's been kind of intense getting those ready and preparing, but now they're all done and they were all great. It was fun.
That's great. I really like your lecture about timelines and evidence analysis. It's really an important step.
It is, and it's a fun case study. It's a Swedish man whose identity was merged with another one that led the family off in the completely wrong place for discovering more about him. He had disappeared from Sweden, and they knew only that he went to the United States, and all their research thought that he ended up in 1930 in Massachusetts. But when I separated out the identities, it turns out he went to Canada, and his last record there was 1926. So it's a big difference if you are researching in Canada or Massachusetts. So hopefully they'll be able to make more progress now that those merged identities were separated. But it really was the timeline that made the huge difference.
Yeah, that's really good that the timeline could help you separate them out. And often that's what we have to do when we're working with people of the same name.
Yep.
Well, for announcements, we just wanted to remind you that our study group for the fall with DNA is happening in a couple weeks. So if you still want to register and join us, you can. Also, if you want to get on the waiting list, you can email us. And then for the next study group in the spring, we're doing Research Like a Pro with DNA again. And then in the fall, we'll have the traditional Research Like a Pro study group. So just looking ahead. And there's an email list you can join if you want to get updates about study group information.
We're excited to get started, and I'm excited to do a new project. It'll be so fun. Well, today we've got Allison Kotter back. Hi, Allison.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
You are so welcome. This is our final podcast with Allison, and we're going to find out all about the writing process and what she discovered when she wrote up her project. So, just review for us a little bit about how your project went, because you did the Research Like a Pro with DNA eCourse.
Right. And so that was nice because I just did every lesson as a step. I started with knowing nothing about DNA, and I still don't know too much, but I was able to complete my project and come to a conclusion, at least for this phase of the research. So I did my lucid charts, my analyzing, did some research, and I found that all the centimorgans for my matches and the test takers I had were not matching up exactly as they should if the traditional work I had done was correct.
Oh, that's always, at first, it's very unsettling. And then you just think, okay, I've got to dig in and figure this out.
Yeah, and it's exciting to get the right answer. I've been dealing with these names for so long, and I like that I'm starting to sort out their puzzle to a more correct way.
Right. And it is really good to find the answer. I know sometimes we just have to sit with it for a little bit and think about, oh, okay, so all of my previous work, my preconceptions were not accurate. Oh, dang it. But now I'm going to find the right answer. It happens to all of us.
Yeah, it's part of being a genealogist for sure.
Absolutely. So, how did you get started in writing your report?
For me, I think the hardest part of writing your report is starting to write it. So I like to sit down and write a very casual kind of outline, like as if I was talking to one of my friends and explaining my project to them. That helps me figure out a logical way to explain the project. So when I do that, I don't write any footnotes or anything. It's just as if I was sending an email to a friend, and then I make that into my outline. So that's normally how I start my writing.
Oh, I really like that idea.
Yeah, it helps me get over my nerves of writing the perfect paper from the get go, too.
Good idea.
Let's get a reminder of what your objective was for this project.
The objective of this research project was to use DNA and genealogical records to determine the biological father of Mary Ella Parker, born on the 22nd of August, 1877, in Baldwin County, Alabama. Mary Ella died on the 28th of December, 1950, in Columbus, Muskogee, Georgia. And the test taker is 3 generations from the research subject, and autosomal DNA will be applicable. The community of the research subject also experienced pedigree collapse, so there may be multiple most recent common ancestors with the test taker. Mitochondrial DNA is also not useful in this case as it is not an unbroken paternal line, and Y-DNA is not useful in this case as it is not an unbroken paternal line.
So basically, you're using autosomal DNA to help you figure out the parents of Mariella Parker.
Correct. And she is the great grandmother of my mother in law. So I was using my mother in law's DNA. And then in the last step, I also got her father's DNA. So my grandpa in law. And then one of the other cousins that I was working with shared his DNA with me too.
That was really great that that happened.
Yeah.
So, when you're writing your research report, I've noticed sometimes I'm tempted to adjust my research objective with what I had found during the project so that it's more accurate. But kind of realized, I have to keep it the same as what I started so that I know what my starting point was, and then I can kind of correct it as I go along. But I think it is a good idea to kind of revisit your objective and just make sure that you put it at the beginning of your research report and that kind of thing. What do you think?
Yeah, it's helped me putting it at the beginning because as I start writing, sometimes I get really excited about writing some fun fact I learned or something. And if you go back and read the objective, you're like, well, is this helping me with my objective, or is this a separate objective that I'm answering here? So I think it's really important to be very clear with your objective and have it at the beginning of your paper so that both you and the reader are on track.
That's a good point. Yeah.
I really like what you said about what fun facts should you put in, what should you leave out, staying focused on that objective. Always something to keep in mind that we want to have everything being supportive of that objective because you do discover some interesting things. And sometimes if the objective is to learn everything about an ancestor, then of course we'd put that in. But in this case where you're really focused on finding the biological father, you had to probably cut some things. Well, let's talk about the next part, which is the results summary. How did this work out for you?
So I wrote the results summary last after I finished my paper. So I kind of went through each of my sections and found my conclusions. But I like this section because genealogical papers, and especially with DNA, are not light reads. And a lot of times your client, or for example, like my family, my mother in law, they don't have a lot of background in genealogy. And so it can be overwhelming when I hand them a 20-page report and all they want is the answer. And so I like the results summary because it can just bullet point what we found. For this, what I wrote was that I reviewed the traditional genealogy, which showed that Mariella was the daughter of William Parker and Zillah Beck. And then I conducted multiple leads method analysis for my test takers, Leslie, Philip, and Mark. And I identified the genetic networks that I needed to use in the project. And then I calculated the average centimorgans shared between each test taker and the descendants of the Parkers versus the descendants of the Barnes. And then I identified a group of matches between Philip Sutton and Mark that indicated a paternal link between the two test takers. And I explored the likelihood that Mary Ella is the biological daughter of Sarah Barnes, who was an unwed 17-year-old girl at the time of Mary's birth.
I like that you just put that right in there at the beginning. You didn't try to make this a mystery and give a big ta-da thing at the end. The reason why I like that is because then it's in the reader's head. And as they're reading through your paper, they're looking for the evidence that's going to show that. I think it's a good preparation.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes I think my writing is really clear, but if you're not used to genealogy or DNA, you can maybe get lost in the centimorgans, and so you might not understand, oh, this is the conclusion we came to. Hopefully, you write it also later, but I think it can get easy to get lost in the paper if you're not comfortable with the subject.
Well, it's repetition. You would need to see it again and again and again to understand what's happening here. So good job. And I noticed that you did what we recommend, which is using those action verbs such as reviewed, conducted, and calculated. I really like that because I think it helps to propel the reader forward. Was that hard to try to write that with the active verbs?
Well, I've been through Research Like a Pro a few times and I've have a growing list. So when I read other papers, I'm like, oh, I like that one, or, things like that. So that's helped is having a growing list and reading other examples helps me with my writing
Yeah,
a lot.
that is such a good idea. And I have found that as I read the National Genealogy Society quarterly articles that I have been highlighting the active verbs all through the writing, not just like in a summary of results. They're doing proof arguments, so they do a different format. But I love seeing how they use the active verbs to state things. So getting rid of so much of the was and is and the are, using words that really help the reader to get more out of it than that active voice. So good
Yes,
job.
thanks.
Well, the next section of the report is for the background information. So tell us what you included there.
Yeah, so here I just kind of wrote about what we'd been talking about in the other podcast, which is where I had decided that traditional genealogy showed that William Parker and Zillah Beck were the parents of Mary Ella Parker. However, I was communicating with a cousin who explained that Mary Ella was actually the daughter of Zillah's first husband, Mr. Barnes, and adopted the Parker name because William Parker raised her. So I explained that in the background, and then I also explained that the sources show that Mariella was born in 1877. William and Zillah were married in 1875. Therefore, it seems that she was most likely a Parker. However, the DNA is going to tell us if that's true or not. I also went through the DNA background. So I showed how we were connected to each generation back. And then the DNA showed that we were related to Zilla Beck, but it did not clearly show who Mariella's father was. And so I showed that all through lucid chart diagrams in my background. And the report is available on the blog post, which I think is linked to this episode as well.
Yeah, that'll be great. So everyone can go and see your lucid chart diagrams. Did you have to break those up so that they would fit into your report?
Yeah, I at first had like a pretty big one, and then I actually had Diana review my paper, and she said, I think this would be better a little broken up so that we could read it. And I was showing it to some other people too, and they all agreed. So I think my background has 4 different lucid charts that I just have split up to try and be really clear about what I thought the DNA was showing at the beginning.
That's a helpful way to start the project, to just kind of show that the generations that you have traced through documentary records are also being proven through the DNA. That gives you such a good starting point for the rest of the research.
I think that's also helpful because if you're starting with the known generations, if your family's reading it, they're familiar with these people. They're like, oh, okay, that's grandma, that's great grandma. So they're understanding how the lucid chart diagram works or whatever diagram program you're using. Then, when you get further on in the report and you're bringing up all these unknown connections, they still can see how it lines up and how it works. So I think that's a great idea to start with the known and introduce them to the methodology and to the charting. Well, let's talk about another step in writing the report, and that's to list out the limitations. And then also, sometimes we want to put in the methodology, what we used for this project, and explaining that to the reader. So what'd you do for that?
So here I read a few different papers just because I had never written a section like this before. So I wrote this little splurge that explains that autosomal DNA is only good for up to 6 to 8 generations back, and that the way I worked through this project is that I would look at what the testing website would report with centimorgans, and the testing website normally tells you what they think the relationship is, but you have to figure that out specifically through the pedigree. And so building back pedigrees and comparing them with other matches and your own pedigree is kind of how you figure out the relationship between you and DNA match, which can then lead to proving your family relationships and finding missing ancestors.
Yeah, it's really important to explain how this works. If someone has never used DNA at all, they have no clue what you're talking about, and you've got to do so much explanation. It's a lot different in a report that's going to be read by family members or clients without DNA experience than perhaps publishing it like a proof argument in a journal where you assume that your audience knows all about DNA. So for these reports, we need to be really good at explaining things. And I think one of the tips, and you mentioned this before, that when you get something really good written up, it's a good explanation, save that in a document and reuse it. Because if we continue working with DNA and different projects, we can use those good explanations over and over, right?
Right. I wish I had included also in this section about pedigree collapse. I deal with that later in the paper, but I think it would have been good to explain right here just so that the reader understood what we were dealing with, especially in
Yeah,
this case.
because that is a severe limitation.
Hmm.
That's a good idea. Well, so the next part, after you've discussed the limitations of methodology, is to put together the findings. So, how did you organize this? Sometimes that's tricky.
Right. I kind of went back to, all right, when I'm explaining this to my friend, what do I want them to understand first before I get into the meat of my research? So I got 3 sections. One was reviewing all the genealogical evidence for Mariella Parker's family. So I kind of touched on it in the background, but I felt like there was more that I needed to get into the meat of than just what I wrote in the background. And then I had the DNA evidence of Mariella Parker's family. So then I started going into the DNA and what conclusions I had come through that. And then my last section was Mariella Parker's exact relationship to the Barnes family. So that's where I explore well, is she a biological daughter of Zilla, or is she actually the granddaughter of Zilla and the daughter of the 17-year-old unwed sister?
Yeah, so doing your explanatory email type writing first helped you to formulate how you really wanted to organize the findings. That's great. And I find with the DNA projects that it's so helpful to lay the foundation with the genealogy first, which is exactly what you did, and then to get into the DNA. And sometimes I like to weave it back and forth so that the reader gets a little bit of a break in between the DNA and get back to some genealogy. But, it is every project's different and you really have to use what works best.
Yeah, I'm working on my second DNA project right now, and it's for somebody else. And I'm finding I'm explaining it in a completely different way than I did in this project.
Yeah, isn't it so interesting? Every project, and not only with DNA involved, but even just a research project, strictly genealogy, I find that I organize different ways, completely dependent upon what the finding is, what the objective was, the client, all of those things come into play.
So, with DNA evidence, there's kind of a lot of different things we have to talk about and display. So, tell us how you discussed your leads method analysis and also how you shared some of the data that's kind of trickier to include in a genealogical report where we're used to doing more narrative.
So I went back through my leads method analysis and kind of explained that this is a clustering method that's supposed to show your four grandparents. Then I shared the leads methods analysis I did for each test taker, showing that Leslie showed 5 groups. Okay, that's pedigree collapse. Leslie's father showed 15 groups. That's severe pedigree collapse. And then Mark, who didn't have any overlapping with Leslie and Philip's leads method analysis, I did his, and he had the 4 distinct groups. So I kind of explained that process. And then I start using this method where I started taking the average amount of DNA shared between each of the test takers and the Parker or Barnes descendants. So I explained that in narrative, and then I also included a table. That way we could kind of see it and you could read about it to understand what I was doing.
It's such a great idea to do a table, and it just makes the data much easier to digest when you can see it in that format.
For me, even while writing it, when I made the table, I started understanding because I have the average amount of centimorgans shared between Mark and the Parker descendants and Mark and the Barnes descendants. And on average, Mark was sharing 33 centimorgans with the Parker descendants and 109 with the Barnes descendants. Okay, so Mark seems to be closely related to the Barnes. Well, then you go to my mother in law, Leslie, and she is sharing about half the amount with the Parker descendants than the Barnes. So 24 centimorgans on average with the Parkers and 55 with the Barnes. So once again, showing she's more related to the Barnes, and her father's DNA showed the same thing. So making the table kind of helped me figure out where I was going with all of this.
It's amazing how in the report writing, we often can see more clearly what we have found. And it's kind of funny because, by then we're done with the project and we're writing up what we found. And then we like have these aha moments. It just shows how important writing is. If you never do the writing part, you really miss out on some of those connections that come from compiling and correlating all the data.
Yeah, I never know what my conclusion is until I start writing. That's what I've learned. I think I know, but I never know until I start writing.
It is so funny. Sometimes I think, well, I should start writing right at the beginning. And I agree that, you can certainly write up your background information at the beginning. You know what you're starting with. And I think that actually is really good because sometimes you don't realize that there's some significant clue hidden in that background information that you thought you had analyzed everything. But when you start writing it, you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is telling me something. So I like to do the background first, but then I really do like to do quite a bit of research so that I wrap my head around the whole project before I start writing. So I know other people have different ways of doing it, but I think we'll have to just practice and see what works the best.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like it changes project to project for me too. Sometimes as I'm working through it, I'm like, oh, I need to write while I do this. But other times I kind of feel like where I need to wrap my head around the whole project before I can even start writing.
Yeah, that's a great point. Really, each project is unique and we need to be flexible, I think is a key thing there. Well, after you've explained all your findings, then you get to write the conclusion. And I love doing the conclusion. How did you feel about this one?
So I felt good about it because when I started the project, I didn't think I was going to have an answer. I really wanted to get to the next generation back of either the Parker or the Barnes, whichever she was related to, but I didn't realize that that's its own project, that just figuring out if she was a Parker or Barnes would take this much. So, with my conclusion, I just went back through my report and I explained that while the traditional research shows her as a daughter of William Parker, the DNA does seem to show that she is related to the Barnes family more than the Parker family. And that when you combine the two, what I think makes the most sense is that she is the biological daughter of Sarah Barnes, who was 17 years old and unwed at the time of her birth. But, anyways, it's all explained in the paper, and I have all these likelihoods filled out, and I have future research that I'm going to be doing to try to show that that's who I think is her mother now.
Isn't that fun when you get to that concluding part of the whole project and then you have all these ideas for the next steps? It's just really satisfying to know that you brought something to an end and that now you know what to do going forward. You don't have this just open ended project that's never going to end. You finish this phase and now you're ready for the next.
Right, and I don't think I would have ever thought to even pursue Sarah Barnes as Mary's mother without doing this project first, and especially without writing it up, because I wasn't even on that track during my research phase. It wasn't until I started writing and really looking at the numbers and the dates where I thought I'm missing something. There's a different answer here.
Exactly. Well, for our listeners, explain why there is still going to be some Parker DNA showing up, or why you're going to have some matches with some Parker surnames. Because if you're proving that he's not the father, why is that coming through the DNA?
That's a great question. So him and Zilla got married and they did have their own biological children. And so we are sharing with those biological children probably as half relationships. But I haven't been able to find any matches with any other Parkers besides those Parkers. To be fair, I haven't found matches of any other Barnes, but the relationships are looking like they're half relationships with those Parker siblings and full relationships with the Barnes siblings that I had found through the traditional research.
Great. I remembered that from our previous conversations, but I wanted to clarify because that can muddy the waters and make it confusing when you are seeing these surnames coming through the matches and they're just coming down through those half siblings. We always have to be on the lookout for the halves. They can mess us up a lot.
Yeah, and now I'm wondering, well, are all the Parker kids that I thought are Parker kids? And so I'm actually collecting DNA from descendants of each of them. I'm trying to at least. I've got a good bit so that I can try and figure out exactly how this family worked out. I'm a little obsessed with this family.
We all have our families that we obsess over. I love it. So just give us in a nutshell kind of your future suggestions that you're going to continue with.
So I would like to try Y-DNA if possible, especially from one of the Parker sons, because this could possibly get past William Parker, and that could help me clearly say, oh, we're not related to this line, or maybe we are. And then I really want to focus on Sarah Barnes. I know very little about her. I have her in the 1880 census. I know of some of her kids, and then she dies. And then there's a family story about who she was with, like the husband. So I just really want to do focus project on her. And then I also want to do a DNA focus project trying to conclude, is Mariella the daughter of Sarah Barnes and who could her father be? So my plan for that is to get other descendants of Mary Ella, because right now I have Leslie and her dad, who are both descended from Mariella, but we have a lot of pedigree collapse actually from the other line. So I want to get DNA from other Mariella Parker descendants. I have DNA from Leslie and her dad, but then Mark is actually descended from one of Mariella's half sisters or full sisters or something like that. And I want to get other Mariella descendants in order to find out who her dad is specifically. And then I also, in my research phase, I found this couple, Frank Ward and Mary Brooks, and I still haven't found how they are connected to the tree. So I want to do a project on that as well.
Well, those sounds like some great ideas. And you have a lot of projects in your future on this family.
Definitely.
But it'll be interesting. And so are you prioritizing those projects?
Yeah, right now, because I'm kind of on the DNA kick, I am collecting DNA of other Mariella descendants and figuring out who the father is. Just
Yeah,
because that's where my head is. I just did this project. I'm excited to figure it out. So that's what I've been working on right now.
it's a great idea. And that could actually break open some of these other questions that you have and give you ideas on those. So,
Yeah, because in order to do that project, I need to kind of do a lot of traditional research on Sarah Barnes. So I'm kind of combining those two.
yeah, that sounds great.
Well, I'm excited to see where this research takes you. And it's true that once you really dive into a research project on a family, you do kind of get obsessed with them and you want to continue and keep working on the targeted testing and really find out what the answer is. So I'm glad that you're able to keep going with that and getting some more test takers. It's exciting.
I've been surprised at how willing people have been to help. I don't know if everyone's always that successful, but so I made my report and I shared it with a bunch of these cousins and I said, "Hey, if you're interested in helping me with this question, like this would help." And they've been super helpful.
That's great. I think it helps a lot to send them the current state of the research by sending them the report and, letting them know that you're a competent genealogist who understands how DNA works. That really inspires confidence in people and they want to help a little more, I think.
Yeah, I think it's helped having the report and not just being like, "Hey, you don't know me, give me your DNA."
So you're focusing on finding independent child lines to test through Mary Ella Parker?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing right now. I've gotten a few. I also have some descendants of Mariella's siblings, whether they're half or full, and I thought their DNA could also help me make things more clear as well, just because I've noticed that they have a little less pedigree collapse than the Sutton line, than Leslie and her father.
That'll be great. And then the more coverage that you get of Mary Ella Parker through her descendants, hopefully it'll become more clear all of those ancestors that she has, that are kind of on that unknown father side. And
Yeah. I actually think, like you were talking at the beginning, I think I'm going to try a network graph next
cool.
to figure out my unknown clusters exactly.
Yeah, that is a really helpful tool. Even when there's pedigree collapse, you can still work with it. So hopefully it's useful for you. Well, thank you for coming, Allison. And when, maybe a year has passed, it would be fun to have you back and get an update on how things are going with this case.
Yeah, and hopefully by then I'll have at least gotten to a point where I can submit my fourth generation project with it too.
Yeah, that would be so great. So that's
It,
for accreditation.
Yeah, that's the goal, which this kind of messed up my generations if it's true. So I need to figure that out.
oh no.
I
Sometimes it works out like that. Well, you're learning so much in the meantime.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, that's why they have you do it for accreditation is because you learn while you go.
Absolutely.
you might have to go around Mary Ella Parker, go to one of her siblings, and then
Yeah, I was actually thinking that. I'm like, I might want to change lines if possible.
And just make it more simple. You totally could do that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for coming, and we hope you have good luck with the continuation of this research. Thanks to all of our listeners, and we'll talk to you guys again next week.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our Research Like a Pro online course or join our next study group. Learn more at FamilyLocket.com. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our eCourse or study group. If you like what you heard and would like to support this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.